I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga, and this week, our Saturday matinee is going to focus on some of the early industrial history of our city, entitled Flow and Fall, the Missing Mills of Old Mississauga. The presentation will explore some of the history of milling in our community and kind of that building block of our early villages and hamlets that is really, in most cases, missing from our landscape today. We look at kind of the early histories of our community, and we can easily reference things like post offices and general stores and churches and schools, and sometimes the old cemeteries that remember the residents of long ago. But from our usual mindset of kind of a historical inventory of buildings that help shape and establish communities, often mills are missing from that list, if you will. And the mills really are one of the most important building blocks in the early landscape of any community. That ability to harness natural power and convert it into mechanical power, and the processes that could support the labor-saving processes that mills allowed to develop in a community. What are mills? Jump right into our program here. And mills, essentially and simply, are a factory or plant consisting of one or more buildings engaged in mechanical manufacturing. That is something that converts or develops and harnesses natural power for conversion into mechanical power. And so the mills themselves, there were dozens of them. Mills had different purposes. Located in a wide array of locations across historic Mississauga. And indeed, most communities that you find when you deal with kind of those early establishing years of when people first arrived and buildings were first being created and post offices were opening up, usually there's a mill at kind of the cornerstone or the backbone of an early development, in a community. Again, what happens in a mill? It's very simply the conversion of water power or natural power to mechanical energy. It's an old technology. It was around for centuries before it was really, came to fore here in historic Ontario. And a mill in that sense became kind of one of those early service centers, if you will, where you could get work done that you could not easily do with manual labor. Ontario was, historic Ontario was a landscape that is considered, in a sense, well-watered. We have lots of natural sources of water power, lots of rivers and streams and creeks and the like, lots of elevation changes. That's part of the key is the speed in which water travels. Mills were products of their time. They served a purpose, and as technology improved and the years went by, mills were replaced or updated with modern machinery, the newest technology and the like. Quite often a mill might be one of the first things built in a community, but also one of the first things replaced or upgraded. And that was a continual process, the desire to always have a industrial entity that was on the forefront of this technology to make saving manual labor even more prevalent as the years went past. So mills became increasingly sophisticated as new methods of harnessing power were established over time. But the end result was also that mills became larger, and as competition increased, some mills disappeared. So as you went forward in time, you had mills modernizing, but you had less and less of them overall. They were able to produce greater and greater materials in single sites. And some sites were just not suitable for continued growth. You kind of outstripped your ability of the power source to grow any further, and those mills gradually would fade over time. Mills succumb for a variety of reasons, whether they be competition or lack of resources, particularly sawmills, as timber resources close to the mill were diminished. It became less profitable to bring in timber from farther afield, and so either the mill would close or perhaps even relocate. And that's part of the story too. This kind of continual turning of the page. These are industrial processes. Again, it's not kind of the romantic inclination that we tend to look back on sometimes with those ideas of stones turning and grinding flour and early settlers hard at work harnessing this natural power. These were entities in the industry, and they were always meant to efficiently and profitably produce a product, regardless of whatever that function might be. Ontario, old Ontario was handmade and harvested by hand very early on. The axe was the tool of choice for those shaping the landscape. Animate power was at hand. That's animals, whether it be ox or the horse, supplementing human power. But those things had to be controlled, housed, fed, and the like. The ability of a community to harness water power gave it an ability to grow and draw other industries to it. Quite often something like flour or wood could not be produced into a serviceable product in a very short period of time. So those that would bring their product to a mill rather than, say, returning home, which would be an arduous and long task of travel back to and from, they may stay in that community for a short period of time while their product was being transformed into its new use, whether it be sawn lumber or weed into flour and so on. But that meant that other services were needed, such as hotels and blacksmith shops and carpentry shops and the like. So they tended to do those things kind of develop in close proximity to the mill. The mill was kind of that early building block that begot other early establishments. Again, Ontario, a well-watered landscape. Surveyors were instructed very early on to note possible mill sites. Mill sites were where water naturally fell and accelerated. There were trials and errors. It's a landscape that was forgiving in that sense. Built of wood for the most part early on. Dams could be washed away in spring floods and ice, and we think of the weather extremes we have in our climate. Each one of those would have certain challenges to the miller in terms of being able to control the water flow, but also being able to produce a product, whether or not that was seasonal or year-round. All of it had its challenges. So again, it was a landscape of trial and error in that sense. Some mills were relatively short-lived. Again, either their power source was unreliable, their product was limited, their need through competition may have diminished in rapid order after establishment, other things establishing nearby. So you ended up having these kind of fits and starts and lots of kind of references and stories to short-lived operations, some longer ones that grew and expanded over time, but again, very much part of our early landscape. Again, it's about harvesting power. It's about mills were about labor-saving machinery, developing mechanical advices. There was a know-how of how these things would operate, but often a lack of capital precluded their use in our very early years. So even though you had the knowledge of water-powered mills in the old country, in England, and even in the United States, in the late 1500s into the 1600s and so on, in Canada, our earliest mill sites are really kind of in the late 1700s, and here in historic Mississauga, our earliest mill sites are dating to the 1820s, and so it's an old technology, but its application really much depended on the capital resources of the communities in which they would develop. There are different ways to harness water power. It's a landscape of dams, races, and flumes. Dams to create a head of water, a rise of water that the miller could control the outflow of that water over the dam or through a flue that would bring the water into the mill or adjacent to the mill, depending where the wheel itself was. The water striking at an elevation against a wheel would turn that wheel. There were different ways to power a mill. The simplest one was called an undershot wheel, which is a wheel that sat directly in the flow of the water itself. These were the simplest, the earliest, and the most unreliable, and the most prone to damage in the seasons. The miller didn't control the flow of water. But by creating mill ponds and elevated flues and the like, transferred more and more of the control of the natural power, the water power, to the hands of the miller himself. And so they developed things known as the breast wheel, the poncelet wheel, the overshot wheel. The higher the water struck on the wheel, the more power, the more torque was developed or was transferred to the wheel itself. And then even as technology improved, the wheels themselves were replaced by things called turbines quite often, and they were even more reliable and more efficient in their transmission from natural to mechanical power. And so as the technology evolved, as the machinery evolved, so did the ways in which water itself was harnessed. Inside the mill, you'd often see a series of wheels, belts, pulleys. Things were in constant motion when a mill was operating. There's not an instant break, if you will. Water power could not instantly be turned off in some cases, and things tended to work by momentum. And so the bells and pulleys within a wheel that were operating often meant that the building was in constant motion. So there was a danger to that as well. Vibrations, noise, lots of moving parts. Buildings were often tall. It was easier to transmit power vertically than it was horizontally. Horizontal power tended to diminish the further away you went from the source, where vertical power could be a direct connection to the wheel that was being turned by the water itself. And again, gravity was easy to use in terms of raising and lowering the product itself. Different floors of the mill may be engaged in different processes of its manufacturing, whereas horizontal applications, the further away you went from source, the power itself would diminish, and that's part of the harnessing of water power prior to the conversion of many mills to electricity, which is a different animal altogether. So the mills themselves, again, just the harnessing and transforming of natural power into mechanical power could be a very complicated network of wheels, pulleys, and belts, and a system that was constant motion. When the wheel was turning, the systems inside a mill would also be turning. It would turn an axle, which was affixed to wheels, and the process of running individual machinery often involved the throwing on or taking off of a belt, which would then turn other portions of machinery. So it could be a very dangerous place in which to work, and we do have stories of accidents and fatalities that came out of mills as well. There are different types of mills. They did different things. There was grist mill, which was really used for animal feed, coarse chop feed. Flour mill, which was for refined flour purposes. They were often replaced by rolling mills. Sawmill, the conversion of natural lumber trees into building materials. Shingle mill, also similar to a sawmill. Turning mill for finer products, such as I think of lathes and cabinet making and things like that. And of course, there were other kinds. There's an oatmeal mill at one point in Mississauga, and many different types of mills, and they would be dependent on their name would be associated with the product that they made, and the machinery is often specific for whatever product they were producing. You wouldn't see a flour mill being used for sawmill purposes. Two very different processes. The one thing they had in common was the conversion of natural power to mechanical energy, but all the equipment and so on would be different. They really did shape the landscape. The mills and their accompanying dams and mill ponds and mill races and flues and all of those kinds of things that are associated with the harnessing and conversion of power resulted in a landscape that was sprinkled by dams, mill ponds, mill races, and mills. And often a road network that supported them to get traffic to their sites. The mills were not often intrinsically tied to the survey grid. The surveyors would come, mills were close to where the power source was. And so these given roads that were created, some of which are still in our landscape today, even though the mills themselves have gone, those given roads were service roads that led to the place of industry, and very much becomes part of the defining element of our early landscape. Well, where were they? Mills were very often located within the valley of a river or a stream, a creek, and close to the valley bottoms, and very close, if not immediately adjacent to the source of power itself, whether it be a dam or a natural waterfall or simply an elevated speed of the water that traveled over an elevation change within the river course. These all became opportunities or potential locations for mill sites. And many were developed. We've had dozens of different mills throughout the history of our city over time. We'll cover a few of them here in the presentation. Also looking at them is, the people that were responsible for the mills themselves. The miller was the person employed with the operation of the mill. Didn't necessarily own the mill, although in some cases they did. But they were a skilled individual in the daily operation and the conversion of materials that happened within a mill. The millwright, however, was an individual or firm that built and serviced mills and machinery. And rather than work at a single mill, millwrights often had a number of mill contracts that they supported, kind of like the engineers of their day. Both were skilled labor. Both were in demand, given the different eras in which they would have been functioning. It was not something that someone would pick up from scratch necessarily. It was something they had to be, particularly like the dressing of stones and the ability to erect and maintenance a dam, the ability to control a water flue or maintain a water wheel. These are all skills that had to be learned before they could be applied. They were usually educated. A lot of evidence suggests they were also literate, not only from the business sense of keeping ledgers, but also the fact that they were educated in the technology of the time. A lot of those early manuals that support what have been resources for millers have a lot of technical expertise in them. So there's an expectation that you have to be able to understand how the flow of water could be converted based on the height of the fall from, again, natural power to mechanical power. And millers and the accompanying millwrights were often leading citizens of their community. We see a lot of them referenced in kind of our early histories, early organizations, early structures within early social structures within the community, trustees and wardens and the like. Often many are associated with mill production. Locally, starting to look at specific examples in Mississauga, there are a number of small local sawmills that had a limited lifespan. There's Crozier Sawmill adjacent to the Credit River on Sawmill Creek, which is a name that passes down from through our history. O'Hara Sawmill on the west branch of the 16 Mile Creek, Glendenning Sawmill on the Mullet Creek, and there were others. Sawmills like these tended to be smaller operations. They tend to be dependent on the kind of surrounding raw product or raw resources. And as those diminished as the sawmill operated, the sawmill would eventually relocate or simply cease to operate. Most of them left little remembrances behind on the landscape. They didn't tend to impact the landscape as some of the bigger operations like flour mills did, and we'll look at those in a few moments. But again, sawmills are very much part of our historic landscape and the service that they provided in the kind of the early building phases. Think of the early buildings in throughout sprinkled throughout our city that will have wood as part of their core building material to construct the building. Those that are built before 1900, there's no hard or end date to it, but those that are early in our history that survive, most of that lumber would have come from a sawmill at some point. You have examples of some early barns and even houses that it's hand-hewn lumber, where you can see the adze marks on the wood itself. But very early on, that process of hand hewing is replaced by sawn lumber as a more reliable building product. Streetsville was home to many historic mills. Streetsville, more than most of the rest of our city, was a place of milling. Streetsville's coat of arms featured a mill wheel, which is a symbol that was then incorporated into the city of Mississauga's original coat of arms, connecting to that early industry of our community, as represented by the mill wheel. This is just a picture from about 1910 from the north end of Streetsville, right around Ontario Street, looking south along the Credit River. A couple things that strike you looking at this picture is First, the kind of the breadth of the river itself within the valley, and the different mills just seen in this picture. You've got in the foreground of the ruins of John Hyde's Ontario Mills, which was later repurposed for a Streetsville hydro plant. And on the far side there, the remnants of the Bobbin factory, and more specifically, this is the dam that they shared, the old Hyde mill and the Bobbin factory. They shared a dam, one on each side of the river, and shared the power source. And both were early factories that relied on the conversion of water power. And then further down, you've got the former site of Hiram Kassler's mill, and then the Street Dracus mill is still in the distant background there, followed by the Beaty mill, and a little bit not showing in the picture, and downstream of the Beaty Reid mill would have been at the time what was known as McCarthy milling, or the former Barber Brothers site. And so in a very short period of time, you've got, this picture shows multiple mill sites in very close proximity. And just further upstream, not shown in this picture, is the former Alpha Mills of the Rowe family, later taken over by Gooderham and Worts. And so you've got these multiple industrial factories, if you will, mills, dotted along the Credit River Valley within the confines of the village of Streetsville alone. Never mind the outlying side. There were mills in Erindale, there were mills in Meadowvale, and then far up into Peel through Brampton and so on. There are many mill sites identified within the Credit River Valley. The Credit River being one of the most reliable power sources locally in terms of water flow. Timothy Street's mill. This is this mill was located at the foot of Mill Street in Streetsville. A good indication of where the mill was located by following the street grid. Mill Street led to the mill. It was not the only mill, but it was the first mill in Streetsville, outside of a sawmill that was established on Mullet Creek. But Timothy Street, who arrived around 1820 in the Streetsville area, built a milling complex. A grist mill and sawmill to start, but it expanded into other entities. There was a tannery, there was a flour mill at one point. So quite a busy complex at the foot of Mill Street in its heyday. And Timothy Street himself, ceased the operation of the mill in the 1840s. He passed away in the late 1840s, and he was succeeded by others who continued to operate the mill into the 1920s. There's a picture of the mill complex in the top there, looking across the frozen Credit River. Looks like people out sitting on the bank there, but grist mill, tannery, many other kind of focal points to involvement in that community. The mill itself lasted until 1929, when it was consumed by fire, and that's the end of kind of that historic mill connection immediately in Streetsville itself, although there were others that continue to survive to this day. The mills itself, Streetsville mills, were operated over time by John Blaine, John Dracus, and Vic Johnson. Vic Johnson Community Center is named after the last owner of the mill, and owned a large portion of property around that part of Streetsville in the Credit River Valley. And again, the mill burned in 1929. This is a picture looking down Mill Street at the mill fire itself. Downstream from that was the Beaty, what was formerly the Beaty Mill, established by John Beaty in 1837, possibly on the site of Butchert's Mill earlier. That's not confirmed, but certainly John Beaty by 1837 has a mill operating here. It passed from the Beaty family after John's untimely death in the early 1840s. The mill was taken over briefly by his widow, Helen Beaty, Hetty, who was said to be a very dominant businesswoman, and at what was a time it was rare for women to run industrial enterprises. She was succeeded by her son in time. It remained with the Beaty family until 1895, when it was sold to the Reid family, and the Reids operated the mill, including modernizing and updating and expanding the complex between 1895 and 1969, although the Reid family continued some connection to the mill as it went forward under new ownership under Kraft and Nabisco and the like. The mill remains part of our landscape today and is recognized by a plaque from the Ontario Heritage Trust, and it's still operating. Those are the big silos at the south end of Streetsville as you're on Mississauga Road. Part of the earlier mill complex is within the operating mill today that we see. So what looks, it's a modern enterprise, modern milling enterprise along the Credit River, although no longer reliant on water power. long ago converted to electricity, part of the original complex of the historic mill survives within the modern complex that has grown around it. So Reid Milling, former Reid Milling, very much part of our landscape today, and remembered also by Reid Drive, which leads to the mill site. The Ontario Mill Complex was the largest one to operate in historic Streetsville, and it was operated by John Church Hyde at the foot of Ontario Street between 1840 and 1867. Ontario Street takes its name because of the Ontario Mill Complex itself. The Hyde family also operated what was known as the Ontario Hotel, later the Reciprocity Hotel, and a boarding house as well. So they had their hands in a number of early industries, including John Church Hyde was a local politician as well. But again, the largest mill complex in historic Streetsville. And it burned in 1867, and later its remains were converted for use as the Streetsville hydro plant. Again, at the same location, and you can still see the ruins of the Hyde mill along the Credit River at the north end of Streetsville. Just some pictures of it. The mill dam from Ontario. This is the Hyde mill dam. As you're looking across from the Hyde mill site, down at the bottom there, you can see the former Hyde mill site, which was then the power generation site for Streetsville, across to the former Kerr Bobbin factory site on the opposite side of the river. So the dam is no longer in place on the river, although you can see the remainders of the concrete structure on the riverbed today, but the dam has been removed. But give you an idea of the fall of water that would have been harnessed by the mill itself to create its mechanical processes. Again, whether it was the flour mill by John Church Hyde or the later conversion to an electric dynamo, still reliant on the conversion of water power. There's an interesting picture of the rigid airship R100 in its solo flight to Canada from Europe. The picture is taken August 11th, 1930, as the ship is making a return journey from Niagara back to Toronto. Because of headwinds, they had to fly low in the Credit River Valley, and there's a picture of R100 floating quietly above the Streetsville power dam site. You can see the mill in the foreground with the mill dam, and then the mill pond stretching behind it. The large body of water that's created by the creation of the dam. And the ruins today, as they survive on our landscape today, ruins are an important storytelling aspect of the evolution of our city, and they provide a glimpse of previous uses of the way in which people interacted with our landscape. Kerr's Bobbin factory. This was on the opposite side of the river from where the Ontario mills were from John Church Hyde. The Kerr family established a chair factory here in 1851, which was converted to a Bobbin factory in 1857. Ultimately, the family moved the operation to Walkerton and renamed it the Canada School and Bobbin Factory, which operated into the late 1990s. But this was one of our early industries. Bobbins, again, being used in multiple applications in factory settings, and they were one of the largest local producers in what we kind of see the Southern Ontario area for at time. Kerr Street, although spelled with two R's, where there's the family spelled their name with one R, but Kerr Street in Streetsville remembers the Kerr family, and specifically their involvement with the Kerr Bobbin Factory, later known as the Canada School and Bobbin Factory. And upstream, north of Britannia Road, you'll find a street called Alpha Mills Road. And Alpha Mills Road was the old mill road that led to the Alpha Grist Mill. The Alpha Grist Mill was established by Christopher Rowe along the Credit River and north of Streetsville about 1826. And it was purchased by the Gooderham Warts family in 1858, operated at first by James Gooderham, who lived in Streetsville and spent the rest of his life in the Streetsville area. The mill itself burned in 1869, and there is no evidence of the former mill site today. There's been new kind of culverts developed where the mill likely stood, but nonetheless, we have an early picture of the Alpha Grist Mill along the Credit River, again established by Christopher Rowe and purchased and expanded by the Gutterman Worts Company in 1858 before burning in 1869. At the south end of Streetsville, near where Barberton Road is today, in what was formerly the Barber House restaurant, was the site of Comfort's Mill. We don't have a picture of it. Comfort's Mill was replaced by the Barber's Mill, and so this is a very early picture of the Barber Mill. But William Comfort established a mill here sometime in the early 1830s. William Comfort is probably best remembered in connection to the rebellion of 1837 and his sheltering of rebel leader William Lyon Mackenzie, and his subsequent arrest and incarceration for aiding the fugitive, and his untimely demise of his wife due to the cruel treatment of the investigators, or at least those trying to find Mackenzie. That's recounted in the Life and Times of William Lyon Mackenzie by his son-in-law, Charles Lindsay. The Comforts were south of Streetsville. Again, they sheltered Mackenzie in 1837. When William Comfort was released from prison, his wife had already passed away, and he sold his property to the Barber brothers of Georgetown. The Barber brothers purchased Comfort's mill site in 1841. And really for about a 40-year period, they operated a woolen milling empire, for lack of a better word. One of the largest in Canada was right here in historic Mississauga at the south end of Streetsville. The community was dubbed Barberton, and Barbertown Road remembers the connection to Barberton, as does the survival of the historic William Barber House, the former restaurant. Now going under redevelopment, with hopefully a positive future to continue its connection to our landscape and our history. The brothers themselves, there were four brothers, and two of them came to Streetsville. Those were William and Robert Barber. Those are on the left and middle there, joined by their brother-in-law, Bennett Franklin, who the three of them operated the site here in Barberton between 1841 and 82, and the other two brothers remained in Georgetown with the original mill factory that they had. The Toronto Woollen Mills and McCarthy Milling, they operated out of after the company, the Barber's Toronto Woollen Mills foreclosed in 1882. The site was purchased by Oriental Textiles, and it was converted from a woolen manufactory into creating leather products. And later the Streetsville Woolen Company in 1887, converted to a flour mill in 1917 by W.H. McCarthy and known as McCarthy Milling. McCarthy Mills became a well-known and well-recognized name within the Streetsville and surrounding area. The site itself, the Credit River and Barberton Road, the south end of Streetsville. You can find Barberton Road on our landscape today. It is Mississauga's oldest continually operating industrial site. The surviving flour building was originally built in 1862 on the site of the 1826 mill, and the original stone mill is encased within the stucco and steel structure that you see today. So very much a mill tied to the history of our city and the landscape in which it finds itself. And there's some pictures of the mill complex today. Again, the 1862 mill survives, albeit with a different purpose, and now using electricity instead of water power, as does the 1852 William Barber House. Again, the family purchased the property in 1841, and for a time had expanded and operated William Comfort's original mill before building their own. There were as many at one point as over 40 mill workers' houses along Barberton Road. Only two survive, private residents today, but they are on just adjacent to Eglinton Avenue on the east side of the Credit River. You can see on the north of Eglinton Avenue, you'll see the two mill workers' houses that survive in juxtaposition to the mill owner's house, a much grander affair on the opposite side of the river. So very much, again, tied to the early development of our history. You also have the McGill Flour Mill in Streetsville, located north of Dundas Street in Erindale along the Credit River. It was operated by the McGill family in Erindale, established by John McGill in 1837, and this mill was in the Credit River Valley within what is today Erindale Park, although the mill site itself is obscured in part due to the harnessing of the Credit River for hydroelectric developments in the early 1900s, but also the subsequent landfill to create and rerouting of the river to create Erindale Park as we know it today. But there's the only known picture of the McGill Flour Mill that was again built in 1837. There are a number of other mills in Erindale Village itself. There were sawmills, grist mills, roller flour mills, and others. The picture that we see here, there's one building that is in all the pictures, and that is on the extreme left of the two buildings there. You'll see a stone building with a wooden third floor. That is was referred to as Brown's Flour and Cider Mill, run by the Brown family. It survived the Great Erindale Fire of 1919, only to burn itself a few years later, and the shell of that building stood for a number of years before it succumbed to the widening of Dundas Street in the 1960s, and so there is no remnant of the Brown's cider mill, flour and cider mill from Erindale. Again, built to 1903 and burned just over 20 years later, but one of our more pictured mills, because most of the pictures of early Erindale show the mill and again survived the 1919 fire. Meadowvale, home to many mills. Meadowvale community built on milling in its early years. You had the Crawford Sawmill in 1831. John Simpson opened a sawmill in 1836. That is pictured here. Just in the middle of the picture below the house, you can actually see the sawmill with the lumber scattered around it and the mill race leading to it. The Crawford's mill was purchased by Francis Silverthorne in 1844 and expanded from there. The Silverthorne Mill, again, expanding the Crawford Mill in 1845 and adding a large grist mill. The grist mill first burned in 1857, was rebuilt, and then burned again in 1860, and the effects of which essentially ruined Silverthorne's financial outlook. Eventually the Silverthorne was foreclosed on by the Bank of Upper Canada, which was controlled by the Gooderham family, and the Gooderhams assumed operations in Meadowvale. So the mill that we see in these pictures is the mill that was rebuilt by Gooderham and Warts. They converted it to a barley mill to support their distillery business in Toronto. They had a large barley farm nearby that produced material for the mill. It was a large complex, a large milling complex, and they even established a general store that supported it. One of the well-to-do sons of the family moved to Meadowvale Village to oversee operations of the mill complex. His name was Charles Gooderham, but went by the name of Hawley. Meadowvale Mill continued operating in the Gooderham family into the mid-1880s. Went into a period of decline, but it was revived by Henry Brown in 1913 until a few years later he was tragically killed in his own, falling into his own mill pond. The mill was later converted to a feed mill by Luther Emerson before meeting its ultimate demise. These are architectural drawings of the mill that were created in 1860 when there was some thought to preserving it. The mill itself was finally demolished in 1954, although if you visit Meadowvale Village today, which is a Heritage Conservation District, in a small parkette on the north side of Old Dairy Road, you'll see the remnants of the concrete buttresses and foundation of the old mill, along what was formerly the mill race that brought water power to the mill. And also, similar to Barberton, in a very similar feel, you find the remnant mill workers' houses in Meadowvale, the double houses for employees of the mill that were built between 1845 and 1856, and again, several survive within Meadowvale Village today. There were other mills that dotted around our city. There was a steam-powered sawmill at Burnhamthorpe, another on the Little Etobicoke Creek. They operated from 1850 to 1910, the story of an explosion that destroyed the steam mill at Burnhamthorpe. We don't know a lot more about that. The Silverthorne family, relations to Francis Silverthorne from Meadowvale, about an older branch of the family. They operated a grist mill along the Etobicoke Creek at Somerville, which is right at Dundas Street and the Etobicoke Creek. And again, we reference Sawmill Creek in Erindale Village. There's a place name on our landscape that references a past historic activity, and namely that associated with the Crozier Sawmill. the mills were products of their time. They dotted the landscape. They were many were built of temporary materials, and wood, if you will, might have solid foundations, but the superstructures are often compromised by fire and time. A lot of stories of those things. There were accidents in mills, of course. The mills were vital components of the early development of our city, the early landscape development and the community development, but they were also products of their time. And as those services were replaced, the need for the mills themselves diminished and ceased to be a key component of the industry as transportation improved, as mechanical machinery improved, as the ability to purchase products from farther afield improved, and the mills largely succumbed and disappeared from our landscape. We have remnants of a few mill sites visible on our landscape today, and of course we still have the operating former Reid mill south end of Streetsville, and the former Barber mill, which now operates as ADM milling along Barbertown Road. And that is the end of our presentation, a fascinating look at the early industrial history of the city of Mississauga, and the way in which our early residents sought to harness natural power and convert it into labor-saving machinery with the development of mechanical power sites. The mills, again, a very important building block in the story of our city. So thank you.